My spiciest take of the week. That was the single most overcooked hard-boiled egg I think we have ever seen in the history of the world.
It's the D3 Datacast for the last time this season with an episode to talk about games. We have 1 week left in the season, our last in-season episode. I can't believe we're here, but we are. I'm Zach Snyder, joined by Matt Snyder. How you doing, Matt?
I'm doing great, Zach. I cannot believe we're already down to just 4 teams here in the Division III basketball season. We've completed the round of 64, the round of 32. We had the Sweet 16 and the Elite Eight with the sectional rounds this last weekend, Zach. We're already at the Final Four, our final in-season episode of the year. Let's talk about it because the season came and went basically way too quickly.
It's going to be time to fire up the D3 Datacast cruiser to head down to Fort Wayne. But before we do,
It's a PT Cruiser.
No, we got the Megabus, the John Madden
Yes.
Megabus. Remember?
Yeah.
You remember we started the season with it parked in front of the Shirk Center. Going to take it down to the Allen County War Memorial Coliseum there in Fort Wayne. Great to start the season with the bus, end the season with the bus. But before we fire up the bus, let's talk about what happened last weekend, second weekend of the tournament. A lot of action to go through. Let's start with what happened at Wesleyan. Wesleyan sectional, Matt, started with an 80-78 win for Emory over Mary Washington. Mary Washington, one of the Cinderella darlings of the last couple weeks. Mary Washington took a double-digit first half lead, but found themselves down by double digits. I believe it was like 12-point deficit with 2 minutes to go. But there they were. They had a good look from three with a chance to win it. A follow-up attempt to tie it, but neither goes. Emory, looked like they might kind of cruise there in the second half to victory, but they had to really hold on. But hold on, they did.
I think major shouts to Mary Washington, what they did in this entire tournament, coming in as a sub 500 team, but to make a run like this into the second weekend, to give Emory, a team who's been ranked at the top of Division III all season long, everything they can handle. And it's not like Emory was a fluke, right? They were strong in the UAA all season. They had a great second weekend themselves. But Mary Washington was right there. That look from the three-pointer was a lot better of a look I thought they were going to get. And the putback, I think that's one of those situations where as a player, you probably don't think you have any time at all, but there was probably enough time to, I mean, you have like seconds, right? But to like just not have to just tap it back. But anyway, two pretty good looks for Mary Washington at the end. Neither goes, unfortunately for them. Emory survives, moves on to the Elite Eight, but that was a fantastic game.
Yeah, the run comes to an end, but even in the end there, they were no easy out. And a young team that really came together. I think probably maybe a great case for why it makes sense maybe to award a bid through a conference tournament. It's a team that really had no pool seat, no at-large bid chance, but a young team really grew together, certainly kind of came together, developed over the course of the season. They get in and do some damage. And then even as they go out there, it took Emory everything they had. All right, the host there, Wesleyan, moved on to the sectional final with a 66-50 win over WPI. We talked about Wesleyan's kind of taking care of business in the opening weekend, and that's kind of how I would categorize this game as well. Unfortunately, with so many other games, it was kind of hard to pay much attention to what was going on in Wesleyan's games, just because it felt like there was always a more interesting game going on. A 16-point win here for the Cardinals.
And this is just emblematic of what Wesleyan's season has been. They play WPI, a great team. They were like a top 16 team nationally. They won the NESCAC. They really took kind of control of that league tournament final, I guess, notwithstanding in that. But they really controlled the game, won by 16, really took care of business. Wesleyan has been strong all season long. They were a team that was a computer darling early, but through this tournament, I think they've really shown they're not just a computer darling, they're a real basketball darling as well.
And then in that sectional final, definitely a game worth paying attention to with involving Wesleyan there with a 61-58 overtime win over Emory. Emory never led this game in regulation. They were down 12 with about 7 minutes to play, but were able to force overtime. Down three late in that game, they had three good looks from three, missed them all, and still got another offensive rebound. Ben Pierce decided, I'm just going to take this to the hoop, and gets the and one, so they pick up the three they needed that way. And then Emory, I think, got the first bucket of overtime. That was probably, I believe it ended up being their only lead of the entire game. And as was emblematic of the way this game went, both teams really struggling to score for the first 40 minutes. Both teams really struggled to score in overtime. Uh, but ultimately, Wesleyan gets the 3-point win. I thought it was really interesting going back to the box score, Matt, to look at how even it felt like, or how even everything looked in the box score. Because for much of this game, it felt like,
Yeah.
Wesleyan was kind of holding Emory at arm's length. Everything was a real grind for both teams, but Wesleyan was able to kind of get through that grind with a lead. It was just especially difficult for Emory. So I was a little bit surprised, although I guess I shouldn't be with an overtime game, but just how, you go line by line through that box score, in the team stats, and
Yeah.
everything was very, very even. So I think it was very fitting that you look at one number: field goals attempted, field goals made. The difference was 1 in each category. Wesleyan had exactly 1 more field goal attempted than Emory and exactly 1 more field goal made than Emory.
And that's what it felt like down the stretch. I like to flip around to games as much as possible, but I ended up keying in on this one for basically the entire second half and then into overtime because it got really good late. And my thought in the final 5 minutes of regulation and in overtime is whoever loses this game is going to feel like they had opportunities to make shots to win this game, and I think the defenses had a lot to do with that. It was a terrible shooting night for both teams, both under 33% overall from the floor, both under 18% from the 3-point line. Defense did have a lot to do with that, but also there were looks that just could have gone down for both teams that didn't. They made some big shots when they really needed to. But either team, one or two more makes obviously could have made a huge difference. I think that was the story of the game, was just like you said, one more shot made essentially for Wesleyan. That was the difference. If one team even has a normal shooting night for themselves, they probably win this game, and the other had the same game that they had. They win this game by 5 or 10. Overtime, Wesleyan was able to have just enough when it counted. They looked really good. As I mentioned, they're not just a computer darling. They've won the NESCAC. Now they're into the Final Four. They've beaten good teams along the way, good teams from other regions as well. Wesleyan was great, and at the sectional final, they had just enough to get past Emory.
Yeah, I don't know that it was always good basketball, but it was certainly a good game. It felt like, usually you feel like if you can get in the paint, some good things can happen, but there were an awful lot of paint touches
Yeah.
where just nothing good happened for both sides really. Uh, but one of those games that was a grind, but it was certainly exciting, close to watch. Great finish there. Um, Matt, for as much of an offensive grind as it was, I think we need to shout out Nikki Johnson. Looked like the only player in that first half who was comfortable offensively. I believe it was 16 points in the first half, and considering how much scoring was at a premium, that 16 points might as well have been 30.
Yeah, and I don't know if it was specifically him. I know he had some big shots down the stretch, but when Emory had the 2-point lead, their first 2-point lead in overtime, they made a three. I think it was Nikki Johnson. I'll have to go back and double check, that knocked down a three to put Wesleyan back on top. But he made some big shots down the stretch. It feels like whenever something big was happening for Wesleyan, it was his name being called on the broadcast. So really good game from Nikki Johnson.
So the NESCAC claims that one over the UAA. Maybe a theme to keep in mind, or as we look ahead here. But let's go to the other sectional being hosted by NESCAC. That was at Trinity, where starting the day on Friday was Catholic getting a 95-91 win over Roanoke. The Cardinals trailed by as many as 19 in the second half, never led in regulation, just like we talked about with Emory in that sectional final. But Catholic is able to complete the comeback in overtime, and especially impressive, Matt, because they were playing this game without landmark conference player of the year Sean Nealon, who, according to the broadcast, was unavailable due to illness.
Yeah, really big comeback for Catholic. And Zach, we said last week, it felt like this had been Roanoke's MO the entire season. Not always that they got a big lead and then lost it. Sometimes they were on the other end where they gave up a big lead and then rallied all the way back to win. We saw that in their game against Pfeiffer back in the opening round of this tournament. They got down big and had this comeback that culminated in the last second, kind of a shot to win. Here again, they're up 19. Catholic's a good team, so you can't just coast, obviously, when you're up by 19. But they were up big, and they just kind of let it slip through. I fall into this trap all the time with Roanoke. about to like send a text to you or something like, oh, Roanoke has us in the bag. But nope, it just, the margin got chipped away, chipped away, chipped away. Credit to Catholic. They came back big. They continued a fantastic tournament for them after, losing in the landmark tournament, losing to Drew in that conference twice. Once they get into the national scene, they really had a big run here, making it to the Elite Eight round.
And playing without their player of the year, you need someone to step up. That was CJ Ruoff, 36 points there in that win over Roanoke.
Yeah.
To cap Friday night there at Trinity was Trinity getting a 79-42 win over Western New England. We've seen from Trinity before how they're able to really snowball over an opponent, and that was the case here. You go as deep as this is into the tournament, a Sweet 16 round, to be able to do that to a quality opponent, super impressive. Man, when Trinity gets rolling, they're as scary as anyone.
Yeah, a big win for Trinity. I think they have. They've been in that top 5 mix. I was going to say they cemented themselves as one of the national favorites. They've been in that top 5 mix basically all season long now. Since their Final Four run last season, they just kind of continued that kind of season of dominance as well into this year. A credit to Western New England for really a great tournament run for them. I believe this is their first Sweet 16 appearance for that program, so it was a really big one. They knocked off, NESCAC. Strong NESCAC opponent Hamilton in the first round of this tournament in that Montclair State pod that they won that pod. So just really good showing for Western New England. I think we mentioned it last week. The Conference of New England has a tendency to make deep tournament runs, or at least they have. Previously had been Nichols. This year is Western New England. Dangerous conference once they can get into the national tournament like this. Really good program. Wasn't their night here against a really strong Trinity opponent, but a really, I think, strong tournament run that they can be proud of as well.
In that sectional final, Trinity, Connecticut gets an 86-63 win over Catholic. Sean Nealon was able to return, played 18 minutes off the bench for Catholic. It was just a 4-point game at halftime, but really Trinity poured it on in the second half. And it's one that I was kind of scoreboard watching a little bit more than anything, and saw it was kind of close, and it just seemed like it slowly kind of got away from Catholic to the point where when I saw the final score, I was a little bit surprised. But Trinity outscores Catholic 48-29 in that second half.
And Trinity can get stuff going on both sides of the ball. You get stops and you score buckets on the other end. That's a recipe for things to get out of hand quickly. I feel like Trinity's done that to a lot of teams this year. It's been since when was their loss to Wesleyan, which was the first time those two teams met.
Regular season game.
It was like January 25th or something like that. But they've been on an absolute tear since then. The efficiency ratings have them as the number 1 team in the country, and it's games like this that show why. Catholic had been a hot team. They'd been making a charge in this tournament, but that second half, they just kind of dusted Catholic away. The Bantams look great going into the Final Four, and when do you want to be playing hot? It's right here in mid-March when you're on your way to Fort Wayne, and I feel like as much as anyone, Trinity is that right now.
They certainly are. I mean, the D3 Datacast computer has loved them for a while, entered the tournament as the number 1 team in the efficiency ratings. And they are looking every bit of it, I would say, through the first 2 weekends and heading into the Final Four. All right, NYU sectional started with Redlands getting an 83-72 win over Hampton-Sydney. This was a final score that maybe looks more competitive than it actually was. Redlands was up big in the second half. And Matt, I gotta say, even in the first half, there were times when I was watching the game and it just felt like, okay, it seems like Hampton-Sydney's handling what Redlands is throwing at them pretty well. Because that's always the interesting thing, is how's the team going to handle what Redlands does, just contesting everything.
Yeah.
And even though I was like, yeah, I feel like they're doing a pretty good job. You look at the scoreboard and they're still, down 4 points, 6 points, something like that. And then eventually it did kind of get away. I don't know what the deficit topped out at. It was a 20+ point deficit there at some point in the second half. Hampton-Sydney closes it to make it a little bit closer on the final score, but Redlands super impressive. They were getting it done, doing what they do defensively, but really were converting baskets at a high level as well.
Yeah, I don't know that this game ever really got much into the danger zone. Hampton-Sydney did make a really good run to make it kind of a close and competitive game by the end, but Redlands was always able to stay just out in front. With Redlands, I don't know, you probably can't make too much of the stylistic differences that this team can present to you, especially when they're playing at this high of a level. I don't think that's something Hampton-Sydney sees from the other top teams in the ODAC, at least. Randolph-Macon's not playing this way. Guilford's not playing this way. So it's something, it's tough to handle that when you're not used to it. I think we even saw that a little bit in like Wisconsin Lutheran versus Calvin. Not that they're Wisconsin Lutherans playing like Redlands, but just pressuring the ball more than Calvin was used to seeing. It turned into more turnovers than you're used to. And I think a game like this can be part of that, right? It's just tough to do that for 40 minutes, to be kind of error-free, mistake-free, without Redlands kind of running up on you. And on this night, Redlands was great. Hampton-Sydney just couldn't quite keep up with them.
What I thought was on display is there's certainly the forced errors, right? But you watch the game, you watch a team try to play against a Redlands or a team who plays that kind of style, that pressure style, and you can tell a team is just speeding themselves
Yeah.
up more than they want to, right? So there's the forced errors, but then speeding yourself up leads to some unforced errors where you dribble a ball off your leg, throw it an errant pass, that kind of thing. I thought that was
Yeah.
evident there from Hampton Sydney a bit. Certainly looking a bit uncharacteristic in some regards.
Yeah, sometimes even the times where you do have a moment to make a good decision, you feel like you have to make the fast decision, and you turn it over rather than make a great play. And that just happens because Redlands puts you under so much pressure that you feel like you're pressured all the time.
Right, right. NYU, a 91-59 winner over Hardin Simmons. A good run there for Hardin Simmons, but comes to a crashing end there at NYU.
NYU just looks terrific right now. I mean, I think they have pretty much all season long winning the UAA, which turns out is a good conference, like they did, and then now having a tournament run like they are. NYU is fantastic. Hardin Simmons could not keep up with them. I think this game got out of hand early and kind of stayed out of hand the whole way. Good run for Hardin Simmons to get to the Sweet 16 here, but NYU looks fantastic, and they were fantastic in this game.
And then NYU follows it up with a 75-65 win over Redlands. We talked about Redlands' ability to score the basketball being super important in that win over Hampton-Sydney. Wasn't the case in the same way against NYU. They were down big early, 23-5 to start the game. But then they started finding a little bit. It even as it was a 15-point game in the second half, made a 10-0 run to cut it to 5 with a little over 9 minutes to go. You get down to that range, it's a ball game, right? Just a 5-point lead, over 9 minutes to go. You're not in like run out the clock territory there for NYU. It was definitely a game, but NYU is able to respond, hold Redlands at arm's length from there for a 10-point win to move on to the Final Four.
And a team like Redlands can go on those runs. They force turnovers, especially when they can make shots. We saw last weekend at Tufts, when they really needed to, they got both of those things. They got the turnovers and they made the shots. I think in this game, NYU had just enough to kind of prevent them from going on that really, really, really big run. Always able to kind of keep them maybe a couple of possessions. I don't think that even got down maybe to one possession. I think they were always a couple of possessions away. Redlands was just able not to make the big shot when they needed it, or to get that one extra turnover to really put the ultimate pressure on NYU. The Violets win this game, ends up being by 10. Was a really good game at points in the second half. But again, NYU now headed to the Final Four as a program that's got designs on winning it all, and I think that our computer at least says that they are very much in that mix.
They certainly are. All right, one more to go here. That was in La Crosse, Wisconsin at UW-La Crosse. WashU gets a 59-56 win over Wisconsin Lutheran in a much anticipated rematch of a first round game from a year ago. And, it lived up to the billing again here. Not an overtime thriller like we got last year, but a 3-point win for the Bears.
Yeah, just a really good game. I think a highly anticipated game. Was kind of tight most of the way through. WashU able to find enough to hang on, 3-point win. Credit to the Bears. They were kind of in the crosshairs from Wisconsin Lutheran. I think that was probably a game that they had no trouble getting up for. Speaking of Wisconsin Lutheran, but WashU was right there with them and held on for the victory.
Another really good one to close Friday night in Wisconsin. La Crosse gets a 72-65 win over Illinois Wesleyan. Tight game throughout the first half, but Illinois Wesleyan really came out strong to start the second. Built a lead in the second half there to as many as 16. The Eagles fought back, and I thought J.J. Piter was especially good down the stretch, man. It seemed like anytime they needed a key bucket, a key rebound, making some free throws, he was able to do it. It may not necessarily show in the final score, 72-65, but that was a really good one. 16-point lead. I think Lacrosse turned it all the way to like a 10-point lead, to and then ultimately winning by 7.
Yeah, down the stretch, I was surprised to see how often that they went to Piter and that he just was able to take it down the lane, put it up for a basket. He got a lot of tough baskets. Really, at a high skill level, he was executing down in the post, driving the lane. I was not necessarily expecting to see that. I've seen Lacrosse several times this year, and he's been a good player. But just exactly, I guess how much skill he displayed down the stretch was really impressive. I think he had a great game. And he really, he didn't, as a great team, he didn't carry them to victory over Illinois Wesleyan, but he was a big part of it down the stretch when they kind of turned that big deficit into a lead. Piter was fantastic.
All right, then Saturday night, the host Eagles' luck ran out. WashU gets an 80-66 win to give the UAA their second Final Four team to match up with the two NESCACs heading to Fort Wayne.
It's always interesting when two teams play like these big, intense games the night before, how they're going to respond the next night. WashU was great. 3-point deficit at the half. I think Lacrosse was up, but really a fantastic second half for WashU. They outscored UW Lacrosse. I think it was 45-28 in that second half, and the Bears were absolutely awesome. It was Drake Kinsvader who had a terrific effort to lead the Bears to a victory. I think 31 points and 16 rebounds. Just a fantastic stat line for him. A big win for WashU. Gets back to the Final Four. It's been a little bit of time. I should have looked up what year it was, their last trip to the Final Four. But the Bears go back. Big win over UW Lacrosse on the road. So congrats to WashU.
So our Final Four is set. Wesleyan will take on Trinity in the first semifinal. WashU will take on NYU in the second semifinal. Matt, as just a couple of Midwesterners, we got to see an ODEC conference matchup in person. You don't always get to see that. We saw that at the Final Four last year. This year, we get to see a NESCAC conference matchup. We get to see a UAA conference matchup. That'll be interesting. Let's talk high level here about what we saw in the second weekend of the tournament, though. Before we dive in deep into our Final Four preview, we talked on last week's show about how the first weekend was a really good weekend for underdogs. We break down the win percentages as seen by the D3 Datacast computer for each team, and if you take all those and look at it in terms of like an expected wins value for underdogs, there were more underdog wins than the computer would have given them credit for it, in terms of looking at expected win totals. Not the case. The pendulum swung the other way here in the second weekend between the Sweet 16 and Elite 8 rounds. If you added up the computer win probabilities for the underdogs, the computer would have expected just over 3 underdog wins for the weekend, and there was just one, and that was the Redlands win over Hampton-Sydney. So fun to look at, like, just because a team with a 40% win probability wins over a 60% win probability team doesn't mean that the computer was wrong, right? So you start looking at these games in terms of a more overall approach, right? We know that underdogs will win, and it's just a matter of, and the fun is seeing where it happens and how much it happens. We definitely saw an outperformance by underdogs the opening weekend.
Yeah.
And favorites did a good job of taking care of business in weekend 2.
Yeah, and even though it was pretty much chalk from that standpoint, right? Redlands beat Hampton-Sydney in what was like not even a 60-40 game. That was predicted to be closer than that. I think the other one that, depending on how you looked at the game, could have been an upset was host UW Lacrosse beating Illinois Wesleyan. But once you really account for the home court advantage that was there, that really did turn into UW Lacrosse being favored on that one. But we had some of those great games, right? Teams that were up double digits that maybe lost the lead or still barely hung on. So even though we had the favorites ended up winning, I think we had some really entertaining basketball games, some games that were tight from start to finish. I mean, I was really keyed in on the second half of that Emory Wesleyan game, as we already talked about. Like, that was just like a really fantastic game, even though shots weren't always falling. Teams you could definitely tell were playing their hearts out on that one. So still a really entertaining sectional weekend in here. We're looking forward to a really competitive Final Four, I think.
All right, so let's get into it. Let's take a look at our Final Four preview, starting with our deep dive into the semifinals, like we've done heading into round 1 and into the Sweet 16 round. putting together a show for the matchups that we actually know. And that, as I mentioned, that's going to start on Thursday evening, Thursday late afternoon, with Wesleyan taking on Trinity, Connecticut. A couple teams that know each other well. They played each other in the NESCAC regular season. They played each other in the NESCAC tournament championship. They split those two. Wesleyan got the regular season win. Trinity got the conference tournament win to give Wesleyan their only loss of the season so far. These are two teams the computer has really liked for a long time. As we mentioned earlier, Trinity, Connecticut entered the tournament as the number one rated team in the D3 Datacast efficiency ratings. They've done nothing to lose that. Here they are, number one, taking on number three. And not surprisingly, for a couple of teams that have been near the top all season long, they're elite, really, whether you're talking on the offensive end, the defensive end, they know how to get it done. But, as the computer's number one team, Trinity goes in as the D3 Datacast computer favorite, put a point spread on it. The computer sees them as 4-point favorites.
Yeah, it's not often that you get to a Final Four and you can talk about when these two teams played into the regular season or when these two teams played twice in the regular season in both semifinal matchups, but we get that this year. As you mentioned, they played twice already this year, a 9-point win for Wesleyan and an 8-point win for Trinity. Both of the road teams won both of those games. So if you just average up the scores, Wesleyan scored 69.5 points to Trinity's 69 points in those two games. So it looks like a tight one. It's actually, like you said, our computer has been liking Trinity more recently as the number one team versus Wesleyan as the quote unquote only number three team in the country. So going to be, I think, a fantastic matchup. I think when it comes down to the two games they already played, I think the big difference was the 3-point shooting for Trinity. In the game that Trinity lost, they only shot 28% from three on their 3-point shots. In the game that they won, they shot 50% from their 3-point shots. So if you talk about like the difference between losing a game by 9 and winning by 8, like they shot 26 to 30 attempts in those two games. That will give you that like 17-point swing if you shoot 26 or 28% or 50% and you're putting up that many shots. So I don't think Trinity is going to want to count on making 50% of their 3-point attempts in the national semifinal. But you also hope that they shoot better than 28%. So you shoot something in the 30s, this is going to be a heck of a competitive game. That's what really we're expecting here. And this is just going to be a fantastic one to see.
Then our other semifinal, you could basically copy much of what we just said. Just change the names to NYU and WashU, change all the NESCAC references to UAA. Again, these are two teams that played twice during the season. Two teams the computer's been pretty high on. Maybe at times, Matt, the computer's been a little bit higher on WashU than at certain times top 25 voters may have. Both here in the top 6 overall, both in the top 10 on the offensive and defensive, component of that overall adjusted efficiency number. And yeah, maybe the only difference being that NYU did beat WashU twice compared to the season split that Wesleyan and Trinity saw. But, take it down to computer expectation. And again, NYU is a 4-point favorite, much as Trinity is over Wesleyan, and pretty similar semifinal win probability split of 65-35 here.
Yeah, the computer says this is going to be like a 1 or 2 possession game that they like WashU to hang in right there with NYU. The two games that we actually saw, though, NYU won both of those decisively. 77-62 winners back on February 2nd, and then a week later, doing the conference rotation flip at NYU on February 9th, it was 77-58 that NYU won. So if you average those scores out, NYU 77, WashU 60. They won by an average of 17 points in those two meetings. They won at home. They won on the road. I think WashU, obviously getting into the tournament and winning a couple rounds means everyone's on a hot streak right now. So WashU's been playing a lot better. The computer says this is a tight game, but history says that NYU was able to handle WashU quite convincingly. I looked at the box scores. Biggest thing I can tell from those box scores is that NYU shot better than 50% from the floor in both games, and they also won the rebounding battle quite decisively. So if they can out hustle WashU on the boards and they can stay efficient from the floor, I think that's how they built those kind of 2 17-ish point wins. I wouldn't expect a margin that big, but that's how they did it the first two times. We'll have to see what the national semifinal brings. The third meeting between these two teams, like we said, in both games. So it'll be fascinating to see what actually happens on the floor. WashU's got their work cut out for them, but they also have 2 games of tape to see what NYU did against them specifically to be so effective. So we'll have to see what WashU comes out with on Thursday afternoon.
The other interesting thing, Matt, is I would say, compare the paths of all 4 teams here. WashU probably had the toughest overall path. So, the other 3 have been the kind of computer favorites of the bunch, and certainly WashU is right there, but, maybe a little bit even footing when you compare the path that they had to go through to get here. Um, I don't know that we've seen in recent memory as closely packed of a Final Four. Like
Yeah.
there's no outlier. For as much as we've been talking all season about how, it's really an open field, um, here we are, and we've got the computers number 1, 2, 3, and 6 rated teams.
Yeah, and even just thinking of the Final Fours we've had since COVID, right, has restarted. From the computer spread, we had Randolph Macon and Marietta, who the computers loved, and then we had Elmhurst and Wabash, who the computers they were not necessarily those national elite level teams. And I'm not going to have to remember everyone's computer ranking from the last couple of tournaments, but like
But well,
UW
Whitewater
Whitewater made a big
was a team
run.
that wouldn't have even been in the
Yes.
tournament if they hadn't won the WIAC tournament, and then of course they make their run to the Final Four.
Yep, and even I think last season where Trine won they won the national championship. They were kind of in the teens coming into Final Four weekend, even or at least the tournament, and they made a big run into the national championship game. They won that game, and even coming into that last weekend, our computer only said they had like single-digit percentage to win the national championship, and they took care of business. This year, we're getting 4 of the top 6 teams by our computer rankings in the Final Four. So we're basically getting who we expect to see here, 4 relatively even match teams, almost as even as you could match them up here. And we're seeing a 4-point line and a 4-point line in these first 2 games. So anyone can win. No one has even a 2/3 chance of winning the semifinal. I think that's even bigger than it feels like the lines should be, the percentage chance. But it's basically, not even 2/3, 1/3 in any game. Basically consider these games toss-ups. Anyone can win. Nothing's an upset here.
Well, and when we looked at the overall championship odds at the start of the tournament, heading into the first round, Trinity was number 1, Wesleyan was number 2, NYU was number 3, and then WashU was number 8. So we are getting 4 of the top 8 overall championship odds heading
Yeah.
into the tournament, making it to the final weekend here.
Yeah. And you usually don't see that, right? Someone usually falls, but we've
Right.
got a bunch of the favorites here for some reason.
Now, Matt, we like to cover everything from every single angle. So we got to bring up the yeshiva test here, right?
Oh yeah, that's exactly true. Um, Yeshiva played 3 of these 4 teams. They played Wesleyan, they played Trinity, they played NYU. So I think the big comparison, the big analysis here, WashU is going to be a wild card, so they could come in and just wreck the whole tournament. We don't know. They didn't play Yeshiva, but so the Maccabees played 3 of these teams on the road. The Macs lost to Trinity by 41. On the road, they lost to NYU by 36. And then at home, they lost to Wesleyan by 17, I believe. So you can apply some home. You have to do some home away kind of mathematical gyrations here. But I think by the yeshiva test, Trinity is the big favorite here. 41 points, even if you compare the Wesleyan game, that was a home game for the Macs. Trinity got to play their game at home. I don't think the home court advantage makes up for the 24-point difference in the margin here. So I think the yeshiva test says the Bantams are the big favorite.
There you go. All right, so let's move on to look at that in terms of the updated bracket odds. Not much of the bracket left here with our semifinals and finals only yet to be determined. We talked about the win probabilities for those semifinal games. So the overall percentage chance as seen by the D3 Datacast computer to win the championship, Trinity, Connecticut remains the favorite at 42%. NYU number 2 at 27.8%, Wesleyan number 3 at 20%, WashU at 10.3%. So there again, in keeping with the yeshiva test, but with WashU being the wild card there.
Yep. I think the yeshiva test is what is going to sell it. That's the exact order you'd put them in. You'd put Trinity 1, NYU 2, Wesleyan 3. And WashU, the wild card, they're at number 4. The computer thinks that they're the 6th best team in the country. So you give them, basically 30 or so % odds to beat everyone. So their odds come in at about 10% there.
And then when we took a look at this view last year, that percentage to win championship for Trine was just 4%, right? So, 10.3 there for WashU might not seem like a lot, but if you consider, they're the underdog in their semifinal matchup and would be an underdog in the any potential championship game, right? So even odds across the board would be 25% for everyone, but when you're in that underdog position, you're going to be something less than that. And if you're the favorite position, you're going to be something more than that. So let's go on. Let's look at those potential matchups and what that would be seen by in terms of a computer line, starting with a potential Wesleyan NYU championship game.
Yeah, this one looks like the most even. Wesleyan and NYU are like the 2 and 3 teams in the country by the computer. They both were number 1 seeds in the tournament here in their quadrant. But this would just be a half a point line, basically a pick 'em. But the computer would favor NYU by a half a point in what would be the most even matchup potentially in the championship game.
And then a couple differing matchups, but would have kind of similar computer expectation in terms of point spread. Trinity would be a 3.5 point favorite over NYU, and Wesleyan would be a 4 point favorite over WashU.
Yeah, these games are basically what we're kind of seeing in the semifinal matchups, is kind of like 4-ish point margins. So they would be kind of, the computer thinks they would look like the semifinals. Wesleyan and WashU would be a pretty close game, just like a 2-possession game. And then likewise, Trinity and NYU would be the same kind of a thing. Both of those games would favor the NESCAC. So it looks like the NESCAC is almost always the favorite. The only thing would be that half a point line if it's Wesleyan versus NYU. Otherwise, the NESCAC team looks like the favorite. The only one that we're going to call the quote-unquote mismatch, which is only a 7.5 point game, but that's Trinity versus WashU. That's the computer's number 1 team in the country versus the computer's number 6 team in the country. That's where it gets to be a 3-possession game by a predicted computer scoring margin, where everything else looks like it's a bucket or two. And when it's a bucket or two, you're talking about a turnover that you didn't expect, an unforced error, a team making a 3-pointer. Like, how often do you watch a game and a team like has a crazy buzzer beater shot that just like gets banked in, and that's like a random, should have been a miss, but it's a make. That's like 3 points. That's most of the difference right here. So you're talking about these types of spreads. If one crazy thing happens in the game, all of a sudden it's like back to an even scoring margin. And we see that all the time in Division III basketball.
Should be a great weekend of basketball. Hope to see you in Fort Wayne. We'll be there checking it all out in person again this year. Hopefully you can make it out if you're in the Fort Wayne area or a fan of one of these teams. It's a fun trip to make every year. But if not, the games will be airing on ESPN Plus. We've got details in a blog post on d3datacast.com to help you with that schedule, some direct links. But basically all you need to know for this year, there's no more worrying about whether CBS Sports Network is on your plan or not, or on a separate sports tier, or if they're going to air it live even versus a tape delay. No, it's all just going to be on ESPN Plus. So it should be easy to know. Either you subscribe to that streaming platform or you don't. And so anyway, just always want to make sure that people know where to find the game, and that really encourage people to take just a couple minutes ahead of time. Make sure you've got your access, get your access in place, if you need to do so you're not scrambling to do that at tip time. It seems like every year we're getting messages from people asking where to find the game, how to find the game. So try to put all that information out on d3datacast.com. Check out the blog post there.
All right.
All right, we talked about last weekend, but let's review it one more time in the form of how we did in our pick slate.
Here are 5 games that we had picked from the Sweet 16 round to pick against. Zach, our first one was Catholic and Roanoke. Catholic were half-point favorites by the computer. They actually won that game in overtime by 4, and I won that pick. Redlands was 2-point underdogs versus Hampton-Sydney, but as we discussed, they won that game by double digits. Zach, you had that one correct. I went with Hampton-Sydney. You had picked Redlands to cover, and boy, did they, winning that game. Wisconsin Lutheran and WashU was our third game. The computer liked WashU by 5.5. They actually only won by 3. So Wisconsin Lutheran covered that computer spread, Zach, and you got that point as well. Our fourth game was WPI at Wesleyan. This was a 12.5-point scoring line. I thought that scoring line was too big and went with WPI, but you were not scared of the big number, and turned out to be correct as Wesleyan won this game by 16 points and covered the big scoring line. And our D3 Datacast game of the week ended up being a pretty good one out in La Crosse. Illinois Wesleyan was 2-point underdogs at UW La Crosse, but La Crosse won that game by 7. We talked about that big lead that Illinois Wesleyan had in the second half that slipped away. We both went with the Titans, and we were both burned by that one with UW La Crosse covering that computer line. So let's look at the scoring total. Zach, you were 3-2 last week. That pulls you to 44, 47, and 4. I was 1-4 last week to go to 48, 43, and 4. So I've guaranteed myself a 500 or better record. Zach, you have work to do to get up to that mark. All right, Zach, we're going to turn our attention to our Final Four weekend picks, which we do a little bit differently since we only know 2 games. So first, we're going to pick against the 2 games that we do know, and then we're going to each pick our winners to advance to the championship, and then we're going to call our shot with that championship winner. Are you ready for this week's picks?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
All right, first game is Trinity against Wesleyan. As we already looked at, the computer has a 4-point line in favor of Trinity in this neutral court Fort Wayne, Indiana game. Who do you like against that computer line?
Well, Matt, I'm not going to give away who I have in my championship game just yet, but I'm taking the points with Wesleyan. So that leaves a little bit of doubt. Give me the 4 points.
So Wesleyan to cover, but not necessarily to win.
We'll find out in a little bit.
All right. In my first pick and that game, the 4-point line is not scaring me right now. I'm going to pick Trinity to cover the 4 points, to give away 4 points and cover that and win. So I guess I'm spoiling one of my picks here. Although the second game here, Zach, WashU, 4-point underdogs versus NYU, another conference matchup in this neutral site in Fort Wayne. What's your pick?
Once again, I will take the points and therefore not spoil who I have advancing to the championship game.
Taking the Bears to at least keep it
close. Take
close.
the 4 points in both games. Yes, I'm expecting at least the underdog to keep it close.
All right, Zach. Well, I'm just going to go with favorites across the board. NYU giving up 4 points. They've won by double digits both those games. What's a third game by more than 4 points to win? So I will go with NYU, Zach. So now it's time for you to call your shot. Who are your 2 winners and your champion?
Call it. All right, advancing to Saturday's championship game, I have Trinity and WashU.
All right, Trinity and WashU for a national championship. And who do you like as the winner?
This one, I have the Bantams winning it all. I think they've been very impressive. And Matt, we haven't even talked about this yet, but I think there's got to be some sort of advantage in the fact that they've made this trip before. Like they made this trip last year. The environment will not be new to them. The venue will not be new, or at least to all of them. I think that there's an advantage in that. They've been playing great. I like the Bantams to get it done.
Yeah, they've got a bunch of guys that played there last year, and last year when they played in the semifinal, the opposing team had like 8,000 people in the crowd in favor of them. I don't know.
It was more like a road game.
Yeah, I don't know what kind of a crowd WashU is going to bring, but it's not going to be as big as Trine brought from like 45 minutes away. Probably not. All right, Zach, I am also choosing the Bantams to win the semifinal game, but I'm going to pick NYU to win the other semifinal. So I'm going to get my NESCAC is still going to be Trinity, but my UAA is going to be NYU. And my national champion pick is going to be the Violets of NYU, claiming the walnut and bronze. That is my pick, Zach. So we have, I think, 4 differences in our picks. And I think you might be behind me by 4 points. So I think you can tie.
I am. So at best I can tie. Okay.
All right. Playing for the tie, Zach. You're playing for the tie.
I'm playing to be right. I've always played to be right.
Okay.
But I'm under 500. So how well has that worked out for me?
Well, I guess congrats to Wesleyan for making the national championship game. I think that's
and winning it all. Right.
Yeah.
So does this mean that Wesleyan's going to win it all and they're going to be champion? They're going to start like chanting 20%, like we saw last year with Trine taking the podium and 4%.
Yes, exactly that.
All right, we've got a mailbag here from our friend Scott Peterson, who says the last 8 remaining in D3 men's basketball and women's basketball includes 3 elite national universities, WashU, NYU times 2, 3 highly selective East Coast liberal arts school, Smith, Trinity, and Wesleyan, and two large publics, UW Stout and UW Oshkosh. Zero small colleges that are generally accessible, even though that's most of what makes up D3. Is this good, bad, or other?
I, do you have an initial reaction? I think this is just what happens to be this year. So I don't know. I think if we have a long term trend of that being the case, I just speaking of men's basketball because I can picture the teams in my mind who've been there recently. I don't think this has been a long term trend. Like if it hasn't been a UAA in several years. We had a NESCAC last year. But we also had two ODACs. We had Trine winning the national championship. We've had a UW school in men's basketball, but it was UW Whitewater a few weeks back. We also had Mount Union was in there as well. I think this just happens to be the group of teams we have this year. I don't think it's a long-term trend. If over the course, if the trend of Division III builds up that it's like well-resourced, selective institutions that are the only ones that can compete, I think that's one thing. But even here we see kind of like let's just call it selective schools, fancy schools. I think we use the term fancy schools around our parts. But then you're also lumping them in with some of the UWs like Oshkosh and Scout. Those are two very different types of schools. So I don't think we're pushing out everyone in Division III just because these teams have made it this year.
Yeah, my initial reaction was very similar to you. And again, I don't necessarily know the institutional profile of every Division III school. Like I know their teams, and that's pretty much it. So like I don't mean this as any disrespect because I don't necessarily know kind of the profile of like a Hampton Sydney or a Guilford. But again, like my sense is okay, yeah, you have Trinity last year, but then you've got maybe three other schools that fit more into this profile, like Scott is pointing out, is not included in this year's field, right? With Hampton Sydney, Guilford, and Trine. But Matt, this also made me think of a conversation I had with someone very much currently involved in Division III athletics, who was pointing out that if you look at things like success in the Learfield Directors Cup, which is kind of like in all sports standings at
Yeah.
Division I, Division II, Division III. So if you look at like the D3 level, the Learfield Cup standings, your success or ability, to compete in there is sort of marked by being at least one of three things. A large endowment, state school, or religious affiliation. Now, not to say that having any one of those things guarantees any sort of success, or not having any of those three things, precludes you from having any sort of success. But being in one of those three categories generally is what you see in a list of teams. So to Scott's question, I think a little bit kind of D3 athletics to some extent is that. Um, but like you said, there's a lot of ground between a school like a UW, who is like a state school, a school like the UAAs that, or in the NESCACs, who have billion-plus-dollar um, endowments, and then also like you look at schools like Hope, Calvin, Wheaton, who have that religious affiliation perspective, like standpoint that helps draw students in, I think, for a particular type of student who's looking for a particular type of education. So again, I don't know that it's necessarily good, bad, or other. I think it is what the larger environment is, even though on a sport level you might be able to look at recent history and find plenty of examples of teams from a variety of institutional profiles being able to compete.
It very clearly takes resources to run an athletics department in Division III. So schools with resources are going to be at a better advantages than schools with less resources. But I don't know that like the UW schools are all in great financial shape. I mean, there's a lot of schools that are not in what they would call tremendous financial shape right now. There maybe some of these UAAs and NESCACs are one of the few that are, but maybe the UWs aren't. They have kind of the advantages that are built in with state schools, but they have some of the disadvantages that some of the other private schools have. So I think there's different types of schools that can win. I hope that this is just a snapshot of a year and not necessarily a long-term trend. Although I think you're right, Zach. The teams that you see that are in like the Directors Cup standings maybe tends to have more similarities than teams that can maybe compete in one or two sports at a time.
And it's something to watch as we know that the landscape for higher education is becoming more difficult rather than less difficult.
Yeah.
And so we may see some of these factors even increase in their importance heading down the line as more schools close, funding becomes more difficult, all that kind of thing. It's unfortunate, but it's the reality we're living in today. All right, that wraps it up, Matt. You ready? You got your bags packed? You ready to go?
Not packed yet, but they'll be packed in like 2 days, and they'll be sitting at the foot of my bed for like another 2 days before we actually hit the road. But always excited to go to Fort Wayne. It's like the Division III Super Bowl. You see people from all over. You see coaches and players coming in for the All-Star game. You see coaches and fans coming in for obviously the games, the Final Four games. You see like NABC folks around, so it's really cool. Interact with fans, interact with coaches, see some players, see some great basketball first and foremost, and crown a national champion. That's what we're all there for, Zach. That's what you and I love to see, and we're so thankful for the people that have joined us on this D3 Datacast journey through our Patreon page, patreon.com/D3Datacast. We offer a $5 and $3 subscription option if you would like to join with us in creating these episodes and making D3Datacast.com an ad-free experience. Zach, we had a lot of fun tracking NPI for the first time ever this year on D3Datacast.com, doing team ratings, doing team projections, daily score predictions, and the like. So thanks to all of you who have joined with us in helping to give that experience to everyone in the Division III community.
And a lot of people took advantage of that opportunity, Matt, because D3Datacast.com registered over 250,000 page views this year. And those were all ad free, no paywalls, all because of the support we received from these people. So, with that, we're on our way to Fort Wayne, and we say, good
Good
job,
job,
team.
team.